HOA Karen tried to tow a government car. It backfired, hard. You think a car parked in a driveway is nothing. Just another neighbor, just another complaint. But in this neighborhood, one car started a war. And the woman who thought she made the rules picked a fight with the one man she should have left alone. This isn't a story about regulations. It's a story about control, about silence power, and what happens when the quietest man becomes the last one standing. Because sometimes the biggest threat doesn't make a sound. You could say it was supposed to be a fresh start, new zip code, new walls, new air to breathe. Mason pulled into the quiet cul-de-sac. Just before sunset, the hum of his black sedan fading as he cut the engine. The neighborhood was unnervingly perfect, manicured lawns, driveways polished like showroom floors, mailboxes lined up like obedient soldiers, the kind of place where people measured status by the shade of their mulch and the straightness of their hedges. He sat behind the wheel for a moment longer than he needed to, just breathing, observing. He wasn't here for the scenery. The house was modest, a 3-bedroom ranch with white siding and a sagging porch swing that creaked in the breeze. It had character, something most of the other copy-paste homes on the block lacked. That's what had drawn him here, or at least that's what he told the real estate agent. In truth, Mason had chosen this house for one reason: the line of sight from every corner. No blind spots, just how he liked it. He stepped out of the car and stretched. Duffel bag slung over one shoulder, key in hand, he approached the door, pausing briefly to look up at the camera mounted above his garage. Already active. Good. Inside the house smelled faintly of paint and new beginnings. Boxes stacked in the hallway still sealed. Mason didn't rush to unpack. He moved like a man who knew every step counted, and the fewer unnecessary ones, the better. He checked the windows, the doors, the back gate. Old habits didn't die. They calcified. In the garage, the black sedan sat like a loyal dog. To anyone else, it looked unremarkable. Sleek, slightly tinted windows. No stickers, no flair. But it wasn't just a car. Not really. It was a shell housing something more complex than anyone in this neighborhood could imagine. And Mason knew better than to underestimate the consequences of proximity. Still, this place, this sleepy little suburbia, had potential. The kind of quiet that made noise feel personal. You could hear everything: a faucet left, dripping a dog 3 blocks away, a neighbor's sneeze behind closed curtains. Noise meant information. Mason liked information, but peace. He didn't trust that. Peace was just a pause between disasters. The next morning, the neighborhood was exactly as he'd expected, quiet too, polite, unnervingly nosy. While sipping black coffee on his porch, Mason caught glimpses of his new neighbors. Curtains shifting, blinds twitching, the suburban gaze, the passive surveillance of the bored and the entitled. Then came the knock, sharp, 3 taps. Not impatient, not friendly. It was a statement. Mason opened the door, slowly, already knowing what he'd find. She was the type that all neighborhoods like this seemed to birth: polished, assertive, somewhere between overly helpful and borderline hostile. "Hi," she said crisply. "I'm Karen. I'm the president of the HOA." She said it like it came with a military rank. Mason raised an eyebrow, his stance relaxed but not casual. "Nice to meet you," he replied. Neutral tone, calculated warmth. Karen didn't smile. Her clipboard was clutched to her chest like a weapon. "You're new," she continued, eyes sweeping over him, then past him, landing on the black car parked in the driveway. "And so is that." Mason followed her gaze. "That's mine. It doesn't belong here." He let the silence hang in the air long enough to make her shift slightly. "It's just a car," Mason said finally. Karen tilted her head, her expression condescending. "In this neighborhood, we maintain a certain aesthetic. Your vehicle is outside that aesthetic." "Is that in the bylaws?" he asked now, mildly entertained. Karen's jaw tightened. "We'll be reviewing that." She turned without another word, heels clicking on the pavement like gunshots. The encounter lasted 2 minutes, but Mason knew better. This was not the end. It was the opening salvo. Over the next few days, Mason watched as the neighborhood began to close in. Subtle things at first. Side glances, doors that were once open now staying shut. Garbage cans mysteriously knocked over. He noted everything. Patterns formed quickly in places like this. Karen was the eye of the storm. Every movement in the block orbited around her approval, and Mason, he was gravitational interference. On the fourth day, he received his first friendly notice slipped under the door. Dear homeowner, your current vehicle violates the spirit of our community standards and presents a visual disruption to our residents' enjoyment of their neighborhood experience. It went on, and on. Mason read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer. He wasn't here to make enemies, but he wasn't going to run either, not again. Late that night, Mason sat alone in his living room, lights dimmed, laptop open. He typed a sequence only he could remember, accessing a portal hidden beneath layers of encryption. A dark screen flickered. A login blinked. He entered it. A voice crackled through his earpiece. Status position established. Visual resistance detected. He sipped his coffee. Threat minimal. For now. There was a pause. Confirm security integrity of asset. Mason looked toward the garage where the car sat silently under the single beam of a ceiling light. Still sealed, he said, but she's nosy. And this place, it's starting to feel like a petri dish. Too sterile. You can smell the control. Hold position, the voice said. Engage if breached. Remember the package cannot be compromised. Mason closed the laptop. He sat in the silence that followed, letting the shadows settle around him. The calm was a lie, but he'd always lived in lies, and soon he knew the storm was going to start knocking. 3 days after the notice, Mason found a second envelope on his doorstep. No return address, no signature, just a single sheet of paper with a printed message that read, "Reminder vehicles that detract from neighborhood harmony are subject to review. Please comply voluntarily to avoid further action. No dear resident, no sincerely." Just threat wrapped in a fake smile. Mason didn't flinch. He simply folded the paper with precision, walked to his fireplace, and fed it to the flame. Karen had officially launched her campaign. She didn't come back to the door, not directly. That wasn't her style. No, Karen was far more methodical. She preferred to operate behind the veil of neighborhood standards where passive aggression thrived, and plausible deniability was a shield. It began with the gossip. Mason would step out for a walk and feel the hush before it happened. The sudden silence of clipped conversations when he passed by. Neighbors who wouldn't meet his eyes. A woman across the street who snapped her blinds closed the second he glanced her way. He'd seen it all before. Different city, different mission, same playbook. But he wasn't here to make friends. He was here to wait. And Karen had no idea that her war was with a man who understood patience better than she understood control. The first real move came a week later. It was early morning. Mason had just come back from a jog. Sweat clung to his back as he approached the driveway. That's when he saw it. A neon orange sticker plastered across the windshield of his car. Warning: non-compliant vehicle, subject to removal. The handwriting was neat. Female. Aggressively tidy. No mistaking the author. Mason peeled it off slowly, almost thoughtfully. He didn't look around. Didn't need to. He already knew she was watching. Somewhere behind a lace curtain or a rose bush, documenting his every reaction. He walked inside, placed the sticker on his kitchen table, and wrote one word across the top, in red ink, "Noted." From there, the pressure escalated. The emails started next. Karen had managed to dig up his contact information through the HOA database and began sending what she called courtesy reminders. At first, they were short. "Hi, Mason, just checking in on the vehicle issue." Then they got longer, angrier. "We've received multiple complaints about your vehicle's appearance. The board is urging you to resolve the matter before we are forced to take official action." Compliance benefits everyone after all. He ignored every single one. Karen, however, took silence as defiance, so she pivoted. The HOA's official website began displaying new rules, curiously specific ones. No vehicles with dark or tinted windows may remain in driveways overnight. All vehicles must meet aesthetic conformity to preserve community appearance. Mason chuckled. It was always the same with people like her. When power wasn't enough, they rewrote the rules. Soon, there were photos. One morning, Mason walked out to grab his newspaper, an old ritual he maintained to appear normal, and noticed a flash from across the street. Quick. Too quick for a casual snapshot. His eyes scanned the cul-de-sac. Third house on the right. Bedroom window. Movement. By noon, his inbox had another message. Your vehicle has been documented as being parked illegally overnight. This may result in citation under Section 4.3 of the newly ratified HOA guidelines. He looked up Section 4.3. It hadn't existed last week. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was fabricating them. And still, Mason didn't react. Not publicly. But that didn't mean he was passive. Inside the garage, the car had been upgraded. The onboard systems ran diagnostics nightly. Infrared sensors recorded heat signatures from the street. Each face that passed within range was captured, tagged, logged. Mason had files. He had timestamps. He had enough to recreate the neighborhood in 3 dimensions if needed. Because he knew something Karen didn't, this car wasn't just government property. It was bait, and she was circling closer. The final warning came in the form of a printed citation duct taped to his front door. Not slipped under, not mailed, duct taped. A red stamp at the bottom read "Final Notice." Karen's name was now on everything. No more pretense. Mason stood there in the doorway for a full minute, reading every line. The paper flapped slightly in the breeze. He said nothing, just stepped back inside and closed the door. Inside, he sat in front of a secure console and typed a short message. Alert threat vector escalating. Civilian acting as adversary entity. Continued provocation detected. Prepare Tier 2 response. He hit send. Then he leaned back in his chair and waited. That night, Mason stood in his driveway under a starless sky. No porch lights, no sound. Just the weight of silence. Across the street, Karen's lights were still on. She was up late again, probably compiling report screenshots, maybe drafting her next passive-aggressive manifesto to the board. Mason imagined her scribbling notes like a general at war, never realizing she was planning a siege on a fortress built by professionals. He took a sip of water. Then, out of habit, whispered under his breath, "Wrong target, lady. You don't even know what you're aiming at." And with that, he stepped back into the shadows while the neighborhood slept in ignorance, blissfully unaware that the countdown had already begun. The moment Karen taped that citation to his door, she crossed a line she didn't even know existed. To her, it was just another escalation, a final push to win a battle she thought she understood. To Mason, it was authorization. He had waited, measured, observed, but now he would act on his terms. At 3:27 a.m., while the neighborhood slept, Mason stood in his garage. The single light overhead flickered slightly, bathing the black sedan in a dull yellow glow. The air was still, except for the soft hum of the car's onboard systems activating. He placed his hand on the hood. A sensor blinked blue. Authentication required a synthetic voice said, "Level 3 Echo uniform?" Mason replied. The car's internal systems unlocked with a click. A panel beneath the dash slid open, revealing a digital interface and a biometric scanner. Mason pressed his thumb against it. Confirmed, the voice responded. Mission Protocol 7, Passive Surveillance and Strategic Countermeasures. Activate? Mason didn't answer. He just stared at the glowing screen until it faded into darkness again. Not yet. Soon. But first he needed data. He needed leverage. He needed Karen to bury herself deeper. The following morning, Mason did something unusual. He waved at his neighbors, watered his lawn, even made small talk with an elderly couple walking their dog, a gesture that sent visible shockwaves down the street. People watched. Karen noticed. She stood by her mailbox, arms crossed, eyes narrow. He nodded at her, smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a calm before the reckoning. That evening, Mason rolled his car out of the garage and parked it squarely in the center of his driveway, angled just enough to face Karen's front window. He left it there. Didn't move it for 2 days. He wanted her to obsess. She did. At 2:00 a.m. on the second night, Karen crept out of her house with a flashlight and a smartphone in hand. She moved across the lawn with the clumsy precision of someone who thought they were stealthy, but had never actually practiced stealth. Mason was watching through a thermal lens. She circled the car, taking photos from every angle. She even tried the door handle. That was her second mistake. The car registered the unauthorized contact and triggered a silent alarm. In Langley, Virginia, a server logged the interaction and sent a flag to Mason's private channel. Karen had just escalated from annoying to dangerous, and she didn't even know it. The next morning, Mason received an HOA-wide email titled, "A Concern for Our Community," unsigned. But everyone knew the author. "We've had reports of a suspicious vehicle, possibly unregistered, posing a potential threat to our neighborhood's safety. Please remain vigilant and do not approach this vehicle. The board is currently exploring enforcement options." Attached were low-resolution photos of Mason's car, clearly taken at night. The images were poorly lit, blurry, and laced with paranoia. Mason leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. It was almost amusing. Almost. But there was something about this that was becoming too unstable. Karen wasn't just poking the bear anymore. She was poking a classified national asset with a broomstick made of HOA rules and blind confidence. That kind of recklessness could get people hurt. At 4:00 p.m. that same day, Mason walked over to Karen's house for the first time. He rang the bell and waited. She answered wearing her signature smugness and a pink visor like she was headed to a tennis match. "Mason," she said with an exaggerated pleasantness. "What a surprise." "Thought we should talk," he said. Her smile stiffened. "About the car?" she asked. "No," he said. "About boundaries." Karen blinked. "Excuse me? You're not just breaking HOA etiquette anymore. You're trespassing, harassing, fabricating, and now you're sending out warnings to the neighborhood like this is your personal militia." She opened her mouth, but Mason didn't stop. "You think this is about a car? It's not. It never was. It's about control, yours, and your inability to stand not having it." Her expression hardened. "You don't understand what this neighborhood stands for?" "No," Mason said, stepping forward. "But I do understand escalation. And you're 3 steps away from a legal nightmare you're not equipped for." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Is that a threat?" Mason leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. "It's a mirror." He turned and walked away, leaving Karen standing in her doorway, jaw clenched, breath shallow. That night, Mason uploaded a data packet to a secure server. The packet included footage of Karen attempting to access the vehicle, voice analysis of her HOA meeting recordings, public record access to HOA finances, a metadata trace document revealing recent HOA bylaw edits, all made from one IP address, Karen's. It wasn't the nuclear option, but it was close. All he needed now was one final push, one final mistake, and she was getting closer. Across the street, Karen stared out her window, scribbling something on her clipboard. Her expression was one of smug determination. She thought she was tightening the noose. She didn't realize the trap was hers. Mason sat back, watching from his darkened study. "On my terms," he muttered. Then he closed the blinds and waited. It happened at exactly 7:14 a.m. on a Wednesday. Mason was sipping his coffee when he heard it, the metallic growl of a tow truck rolling into the cul-de-sac. He didn't need to look. He already knew where it was headed. The sound was deliberate, loud, aggressive, like it wanted to be heard, like it wanted to make a point. He walked to the window anyway, and there it was. A heavy-duty flatbed truck pulling up to his driveway, hazard lights flashing engine, chugging like a predator circling its prey. The driver stepped out, clipboard in hand, expression neutral, but his body language said everything Mason needed to know. This wasn't his call. It was a job. From across the street, Karen stood on her lawn with arms crossed, lips curled in satisfaction, sunglasses hiding eyes that burned with petty victory. She thought this was the end game. She thought she'd won. She had no idea what she was about to set in motion. Mason didn't run. He didn't yell. He simply stepped out of his house and walked toward the truck like a man walking into a storm he'd already mapped. "Morning," he said, voice calm. The driver glanced up from the clipboard, hesitated. "Just here to tow the vehicle," the man said. "Got a formal removal order from the HOA. Name's on it." "Karen, something?" Mason looked at the paper, then at Karen, then back at the driver. "That car's not going anywhere," he said. The driver shrugged. "Look, buddy, I don't care about your beef with the neighborhood queen. I'm just doing my job." "You're about to tow federal property," Mason said evenly. The driver laughed. "Right, and I'm the president." Then he walked toward the car and reached for the winch. That was his mistake. The moment the steel hook clanked against the undercarriage, the car responded. First came the chirp, sharp, shrill, unnatural. Then came the siren, not a car alarm. A deterrent signal, one engineered to scatter birds from miles away and shake internal organs at close range. The kind of thing the military used to disperse mobs in war zones. The tow truck shuddered. The driver fell backward, clutching his ears. Karen staggered on her lawn, yelling something incoherent. Windows up and down the street opened. People poured out of their homes, disoriented, confused. Dogs barked. Children cried. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. Total, eerie, deafening. The kind of silence that follows trauma. Mason stepped forward and knelt beside the driver, who was pale and shaking. "I told you," Mason said, almost gently. "It's not just a car." The driver looked up terrified. "What the hell is that thing?" Before Mason could answer, the black SUVs arrived. 2 of them, unmarked, no plates. They moved like ghosts turning into the street without a sound, stopping with synchronized precision on either side of the tow truck. The doors opened in unison. 2 men stepped out, black suits, black sunglasses, neutral expressions, real professionals. The street froze. Karen's face drained of color. For the first time since Mason had moved in, she looked unsure. She looked human. One of the agents stepped forward, holding out a badge with quiet finality. "Department of Homeland Security," he said, voice firm. "Step away from the vehicle." The crowd murmured. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered, "Is this real?" Karen stepped forward, trying to regain her composure. "There must be some mistake. That car, he's not even complying with community bylaws." The agent didn't blink. "You have interfered with a high-level asset under federal protection," he said. "That is not just illegal, that is actionable." Karen's mouth opened, closed. She looked at Mason. "You set me up," she hissed. Mason didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was doing all the talking now. The agents inspected the vehicle, ran a scan, nodded once. Asset remains secure. One of them confirmed into a communicator. The second agent turned to the tow truck driver. "You're free to go. But we will need your company's compliance on this matter. Expect follow-up." The driver nodded so fast Mason thought his neck might snap. He didn't say a word as he backed the truck out of the driveway, tires crunching gravel. The agents turned to Karen. She braced herself. "You will be contacted," the first agent said, with the precision of a judge delivering a sentence. "Interfering with federal property is a prosecutable offense. Recommend you lawyer up." Karen's voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't know." "That's not a defense," the agent said. Then they turned and left as swiftly as they'd come. No lights, no sirens, just a trail of tension in their wake. By the time Mason returned to his porch, the neighborhood had changed. No more blinds twitching, no more fake smiles, just silence. Karen stood alone on her lawn clipboard, hanging limp in her hand like a flag of surrender. Mason didn't look at her. He didn't need to, because this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The battle was no longer about rules or cars or neighborhood pride. It was about exposure. And Karen had just been exposed to something bigger than her small kingdom could contain. She'd reached for power and grabbed a live wire. Karen hadn't left her house in 2 days. The porch light stayed on all night. The blinds, once fluttering open like clockwork at 7 a.m., were now permanently drawn, casting a faint silhouette of her pacing form through the fabric. Even her prized lawn had started to brown along the edges, a silent casualty of neglect. And the neighborhood had turned. Not with torches and pitchforks, but with something worse. Silence. That terrifying silence reserved for pariahs. The kind of silence that made you feel like your own shadow had abandoned you. It started small. The neighbor who used to wave while jogging past her house stopped. Then the Facebook moms group quietly removed her as admin. Then the emails stopped getting replies. By the 3rd day, someone had removed her nameplate from the HOA bulletin board. No explanation. Just gone. And still Karen refused to leave. Inside, she worked furiously, drafting letters, compiling documents, contacting her lawyer, insisting this was all a mistake, a misunderstanding, a government overreach. "They set me up," she whispered to herself in the mirror, but the more she spoke, the words, the less they sounded like truth, and the more they sounded like desperation. Meanwhile, Mason returned to normal, or at least what passed for normal in his world. He mowed the lawn, washed his car, chatted with the neighbor on the corner who now eyed him with newfound respect or fear. Sometimes the two were indistinguishable. He didn't gloat, didn't strut. But the message was loud and clear. He'd won the first round, and everyone knew it. The story had already spread far beyond the street. Versions varied, of course. Some claimed Mason was FBI. Others whispered NSA. A few were convinced he was just a really intense lawyer with government connections. None of them were right, but they weren't wrong either, and Mason preferred it that way. Let them wonder. Let them keep their distance. By the end of the week, Karen received her first letter. Department of Homeland Security, top left corner. The envelope was thin, but the words inside hit like a hammer. This letter serves as formal notice that you are currently under preliminary investigation for obstruction of federal operations, harassment of federal personnel, and unauthorized interference with classified equipment. Failure to comply with future legal proceedings will result in escalated legal action. You are advised to cease all related communications, document tampering, or public commentary regarding the incident. She read it 3 times, then she vomited into the kitchen sink. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Saturday. Karen had planned to cancel it, send out an emergency notice about ongoing personal matters, but she never got the chance, because someone else had already sent the invite. Linda, the quiet board member, the one who never raised her voice, never took sides, the one everyone forgot. Until now. When Karen arrived clutching her clipboard like a shield, she found the community center already full. Too full. Not the usual 5 or 6 diehards who complained about trash bins. This was a crowd. The buzz in the room stopped when she walked in, and all eyes turned to her. Linda stood calmly at the head of the table. "Karen," she said without warmth, "take a seat." Karen opened her mouth, closed it, sat. No one greeted her. No one even looked directly at her. It was a quiet trial, one without robes or gavels, but with far more judgment. And Linda. She wasn't there to be polite. "I've reviewed the financial records." She began, pulling out a folder, specifically the last 18 months of discretionary spending from the HOA account. Karen's fingers twitched on her clipboard. Linda continued crisp and cold. "You authorized over $8,000 in unapproved expenditures, fencing upgrades, private security cameras, and personal legal consultation fees." She paused, none of which were approved by vote, none of which had community benefit. Karen tried to respond, but the room was already gone. People shaking their heads, whispering, backing away, like they didn't want to catch whatever disease she was carrying. Reputation rot. And once it set in, it spread fast. By Monday morning, the news had reached local outlets. HOA president under federal investigation. No one mentioned the classified nature of Mason's vehicle. That part was scrubbed clean, official, quiet, sanitized. But the optics were brutal. A suburban tyrant brought low by her own obsession with control. And Mason. He didn't need to say a word. His silence was now gospel. The final straw came in the form of a certified letter. It was simple. "This is to inform you that your position as HOA president has been suspended effective immediately pending formal review and financial audit. You are hereby barred from accessing HOA accounts, issuing community notices, or representing the neighborhood in any capacity. All communications must go through legal counsel." Karen stared at it for a long time. Then she tore it in half, then in quarters, then into confetti. And for the first time in years, she cried. Not from rage, but from the hollow realization that she was no longer feared, no longer obeyed, no longer relevant. She had spent her life building a house of rules, and now she was suffocating inside it, alone. Mason sat on his porch that evening, same coffee mug in hand, same calm. He watched the street with the ease of a man who knew the balance had shifted. Karen's porch light flickered once, then went dark. He smirked, not from cruelty, but from clarity. Some people learn when you warn them. Others only learn when the system crushes them. Karen had chosen the second path, and now she'd walk it. Alone. Karen wasn't finished. She couldn't be. People like her don't disappear quietly. They rage, they claw, they file lawsuits. And that's exactly what she did. 2 weeks after her suspension from the HOA, Karen walked into the local courthouse with a freshly pressed blazer and a stack of documents as thick as her denial. She filed a lawsuit against Mason for intentional infliction of emotional distress, reputational harm, and manipulative deception for the purposes of public humiliation. The clerk raised an eyebrow. Karen lifted her chin. "This is a matter of principle," she said, voice tight. But it wasn't principle. It was pride. And pride doesn't win in court, especially when it walks in with a clipboard and a persecution complex. The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing. People who had never stepped foot in a municipal building showed up early, whispering over cups of gas station coffee. The same neighbors who once nodded at Karen with robotic politeness now sat waiting for the spectacle like it was pay-per-view. They wanted answers. They wanted drama. They wanted blood. And Karen, bless her broken compass, gave them everything they asked for. Mason arrived quietly. Dark suit, clean shave, no smile. He didn't need theatrics. He brought facts, evidence, and something far more intimidating, federal silence. That kind of silence that says we know everything. But we won't need to say a word unless you force us to. Karen didn't understand that silence. She only knew noise, and she made plenty of it. When called to the stand, she launched into a shaky but impassioned monologue about neighborhood sanctity standards and the trauma of being deceived by someone pretending to be a normal resident. The judge raised an eyebrow. "So, your claim is that Mr. Mason intentionally disguised his occupation to entrap you?" "Yes," Karen snapped. "He manipulated me into thinking he was a threat so that I would act and then punish me for it with government agents." The judge leaned forward. "Ma'am, do you have any evidence of entrapment?" Karen shuffled through her papers. Her voice cracked. I have screenshots. He was antagonizing me. By parking his car." Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. The silence was brutal. When Mason's lawyer stood, the courtroom shifted. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Your Honor, he began this case isn't about HOA policies or emotional discomfort. It's about an individual who overstepped repeatedly and is now facing the natural consequences of those actions." He paused, then continued, "My client is a federal contractor. His vehicle is classified equipment. Mrs. Karen interfered with said equipment, tampered with it, ordered it, towed an act that resulted in federal intervention." He looked directly at Karen. "She did all of this for control." Karen flinched, visibly sweating now. Now, after having lost her standing in the community, she seeks to weaponize the legal system to play the victim. The lawyer held up a printed screenshot, Karen's own HOA memo calling Mason's car a potential security threat to our way of life. This, he said, is not the language of a concerned citizen. It's the language of a zealot. Dead silence. Even the court stenographer had stopped typing for a second. The judge leaned back, removed her glasses, and stared at Karen. "I've heard many things in my time on the bench, but I have rarely heard a case this absurd, this self-serving, and this divorced from reality." Karen opened her mouth to speak, but the judge held up a hand. "Stop." That one word hit harder than a gavel. The judge turned to the clerk. "Motion to dismiss." "Granted," came the reply. Then the gavel came down. Bang. It echoed like a gunshot. Case closed. Karen stood frozen. For a second she looked like she might protest, scream, throw something. But there was nothing left to throw. No dignity, no authority, no audience. She turned slowly, clipboard clutched like a dying limb, and walked out of the courtroom under the fluorescent lights of failure. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. The silence said it all. Outside the courthouse, Mason paused on the steps watching as Karen disappeared into the parking lot. A reporter tried to intercept him for comment, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. Justice, when it moves correctly, doesn't require applause. It just needs to be seen and heard and remembered. Back home, a new HOA bulletin was posted on the community board. Linda had taken over as interim president. The first line read, "We believe in fairness, transparency, and privacy. And from now on, those values will guide every decision we make." Underneath that line, a small handwritten addition, someone taped to the bottom, "And maybe mind your damn business." Nobody removed it. That night, Mason sat on his porch again, quiet, still. The air was different now, lighter. For the first time since he'd arrived, the neighborhood felt like it was breathing again. Across the street, Karen's house was dark. Not closed, not guarded, just forgotten. And Mason? He finally smiled, not because he'd won, but because the war was over, at least for now. Karen's clipboard hadn't moved from her kitchen table in 6 days. The once proud symbol of her authority, her weapon of order as she called it now, lay buried under unopened mail, half-drunk coffee cups, and grocery receipts she never bothered to file. The woman who used to walk the block twice a day inspecting lawn lengths and mailbox alignments now barely left her home. And when she did, she moved like a ghost. Head down, no eye contact, no clipboard. The queen was dethroned. And the court gone. Whispers began to fill the void she left behind. First came the, "Did you hear?" Then the, "I always thought she was a little extreme," followed by the, "Why didn't we say something sooner?" Regret always arrives late, but gossip is never late, never early. It arrives exactly when shame peaks and civility fades. Karen became the cautionary tale everyone referenced, but no one named. Let's not go full Karen on this. Don't pull a Karen. This isn't a Karen moment, is it? Her name transformed from a signature to a stigma. You could feel it in the air at every backyard, BBQ, every school pickup, every HOA gathering. She had become a verb, a warning, a ghost story told in broad daylight. Meanwhile, the HOA shifted in tone. Meetings were still held, but now they started with laughter instead of silence. The rules were revisited. The minutes were transparent. No more last-minute votes pushed through in Karen's living room. No more surprise citations. No more veiled threats wrapped in polite font. Linda proved to be everything Karen wasn't: quiet, firm, fair. The kind of leader who listened before speaking, who weighed impact before action. Under her direction, old rules were struck down. Aesthetic clause 4.3, gone. Mandatory mailbox paint color, optional. The approved vehicle list, shredded. And the neighborhood didn't collapse. It flourished. Lawns grew a little longer. Children played in the streets without fear of noise complaints. And nobody, not one person, complained about Mason's car ever again. Funny how freedom works when it isn't being monitored. Karen noticed. She watched it all from behind her blind's arms, folded jaw clenched. She saw Linda's emails getting replies in minutes. She saw new neighbors welcomed with baskets instead of warnings. And worse, she saw people smiling, genuinely, not out of fear, but because they finally could. That was the real punishment, not the investigation, not the trial, not the headlines. It was the erasure. Karen had spent years building an empire of control. And now no one remembered her without rolling their eyes. In the privacy of her home, she stewed. She drafted statements, emails, rebuttals to non-existent accusations. She clicked compose and hovered over send, but never clicked it. Because deep down, even beneath the concrete layers of pride she knew, no one was listening anymore. Worse still, no one was watching. Karen, once the center of the block's gravity, had become just another brick in the wall. Mason, on the other hand, kept things simple. He didn't join the HOA, didn't speak at meetings. He attended once silent observant, nodded when Linda introduced a new neighbor-friendly policy. He clapped politely. That was enough. He preferred it that way. His job was done. But the neighborhood wasn't done talking about him. Not in fear, not anymore. Now it was admiration, curiosity, respect. The man who stood up without raising his voice. The man who played the long game and won. No one knew his story, and no one dared ask. They just knew he wasn't the kind of man you pushed, and that was enough. One afternoon, Mason crossed paths with Tom, the guy 3 doors down, who once avoided eye contact like it was a disease. Tom nodded, then cleared his throat. "Hey, just wanted to say, you did the right thing. With Karen, I mean." Mason didn't blink. "I didn't do anything." Tom gave a short laugh. "Exactly." And just like that, the conversation ended. But the message landed. Sometimes doing nothing is louder than screaming. Back at Karen's house, weeds had started creeping up through the edges of her once perfect lawn. The white picket fence she'd fought to have installed with HOA funds was starting to fade, its paint peeling in quiet rebellion. She stood outside one evening, trying to repaint a panel. The brush trembled in her hand. A jogger passed, didn't look at her. A boy rode by on his bike and didn't even slow down. For someone who'd once controlled every inch of this street, the absence of fear was devastating. Power doesn't vanish, it rots. By the end of the month, Karen received one last letter. No government seal this time. Just an envelope with a polite logo. Dear Karen, following a unanimous vote, your full removal from the HOA board has been finalized. We wish you peace and privacy moving forward. Please return any HOA property by the end of the month. Thank you for your past contributions. No signature, no warmth, just finality. And that night, under the cover of darkness, she quietly placed her clipboard into the trash. No ceremony, no dignity. Just plastic and paper, and silence. Defeat doesn't always come with silence. Sometimes it comes with paperwork. Karen wasn't done. She told herself it was about justice, about setting the record straight, about reclaiming her voice in a neighborhood that had turned her into a caricature. But, in truth, it was about relevance. She couldn't bear the quiet, the lack of power, the absence of fear when she entered a room. And so, with trembling hands and an overdrawn credit card, she filed a second lawsuit. This time, it was personal. She accused Mason of emotional sabotage, intentional manipulation, and her favorite term, strategic character assassination. She claimed he had orchestrated a psychological ambush, citing her public disgrace as the direct result of calculated misrepresentation. When asked by a reporter why she was doing this, Karen said, "People need to understand, he's not what he seems." But the problem was, people already knew, and they didn't care. Mason received the court notice on a rainy Tuesday. He read it once, then again, slower. Then he smiled just a little. It wasn't arrogance. It was inevitability. He'd seen this before people who couldn't accept the consequences of their own actions, who turned every loss into someone else's conspiracy. But what Karen didn't understand was that this time the system wasn't interested in her pain. It was tired of her noise. The second trial didn't have the fanfare of the first. No cameras, no crowd, just a bored judge, a yawning clerk, and two attorneys who'd rather be anywhere else. Karen came in with the same binder, the same clipped voice, the same desperation masked as dignity. Mason came in alone, no lawyer. He didn't need one. When the judge asked if he had any statements to make, he stood, adjusted his jacket, and said, "This is the third time she's tried to take control of something that isn't hers. First it was my property, then my silence. Now it's my name. And each time she's failed, not because I stopped her, but because the truth always outruns noise." Then he sat down, and the courtroom went still. Karen blinked rapidly. Her lawyer whispered something to her, but her face was frozen. Not from shock, from realization. She had nothing, no proof, no credibility, no more audience, just echoes of who she used to be. The judge dismissed the case in under 15 minutes. No hesitation, no deliberation. Frivolous, wasteful, and bordering on harassment, she said. And for the first time since Karen had begun her war, someone looked her in the eyes and said exactly what everyone else had been too polite to say. "This isn't justice, ma'am. This is vanity dressed as grievance. And we don't litigate wounded pride in this courtroom. Case closed. Again." Outside the courthouse, there were no reporters, no flashbulbs, just a light breeze and the sound of Mason's shoes tapping against the concrete as he walked past Karen without a glance. But he did speak just once, not loud, not cruel, just simple. "Try peace for once. It might surprise you." And then he was gone. Karen stood in the lot for a long time, unsure of what hurt more, the sting of his words, or the fact that they didn't sting enough to justify a response. That was the worst part. It wasn't the loss, it was the irrelevance. Back home, she didn't cry. Not this time. She sat at her table looking at the now infamous clipboard. Then, with a breath that sounded more like surrender than relief, she opened her laptop and deactivated her neighborhood watch group. Click. Gone. She deleted the folder titled HOA Authority Archives. Click. Gone. She stared at her inbox. Hundreds of unread messages, most now spam. A few replies from lawyers, all useless. She closed the laptop. And with it, the last remnants of who she had been. Not a president, not a protector of peace, just a woman who'd gone too far and couldn't find her way back. Across the street, Mason worked in his garden. Nothing dramatic, just pruning hedges, cutting away the dead. His car remained parked in the driveway, unbothered, untouched, free, just like him. And though he didn't watch Karen's house, he knew. He could feel it. The war was over, and not with explosions, but with exhaustion. Karen still lived on the block, but now she was just the woman across the street. No title, no clipboard, no power. Neighbors didn't fear her anymore. They pitied her. And in a neighborhood like that, pity is the real exile. Mason never gloated. He never told the story. He didn't need to, because in the end, Karen destroyed herself. He had just held the mirror, and she had chosen to shatter it. Some men celebrate victories with noise. Mason did not. There was no champagne, no fist pumps, no telling glances at the neighbors who once whispered behind his back. There was only silence, and that, for a man like Mason, was everything. The car stayed, right where it belonged, black, silent, unyielding. No one mentioned it anymore. No new citations, no veiled emails, no late-night HOA memos with thinly veiled threats. The car had become more than just a vehicle. It was a symbol of the line no one dared to cross again, of the man who had stood still when everyone else had been busy drawing boundaries around the wrong things. Mason's lawn grew just a bit longer than regulation now. His mailbox leaned slightly to the left. His porch light flickered from time to time, and he didn't rush to fix it. Nobody said a word, because Mason had earned something rarer than approval. He had earned space, and space in a tightly wound neighborhood like this was the ultimate currency. Linda visited one afternoon, not in an official capacity, but as a courtesy. She brought fresh bread from the Sunday farmers market. No agenda, no clipboard, just a quiet acknowledgement. "I thought you might appreciate this," she said, placing the wrapped loaf on his porch table. Mason looked at it, then at her. "Thanks," he said. She lingered, then added almost hesitantly, "You know, people are different now, a little less afraid, a little more honest." He gave a small nod. "That's good," Linda hesitated again. "You did that." Mason met her gaze for a beat too long. "I didn't do anything." She smiled faintly. "Exactly." And she left. The house no longer felt like a staging area. Mason had unpacked everything. Books lined the shelves, photos, nothing personal, just landscapes hung in clean frames. The security system remained, of course, silent, efficient, aware. But it wasn't paranoia anymore. It was preparation. And preparedness, Mason believed, was the true mark of peace. Not how quiet things were, but how calmly one could be ready if the quiet broke. Sometimes late at night, he still checked the surveillance logs, not because he expected trouble, but because old habits die slow. The neighborhood was still. Occasionally a dog wandered across a lawn. A teenager snuck out through a basement window. A raccoon tried to outwit a garbage can lid. It was normal, and Mason allowed himself for the first time in months to feel something approaching contentment. Not joy, but rest. And for a man who had spent years living in fragments of names, of missions, of truths, rest was a kind of salvation. Karen, she was still there, still breathing, still watching sometimes from behind the curtain. But she was quiet now, not because she had changed, but because the world around her had. The community had moved on, not out of forgiveness, out of survival. No one wanted to return to the days of fear over mailbox height or lawn color. People remembered what that tension felt like. And Mason, he was the insurance policy. The man they didn't talk to often, but whom they would never cross. Not because he was dangerous, but because he had proven what happened when the quiet man finally answered back. One morning, Mason stood in his driveway sipping coffee as a moving truck pulled into the cul-de-sac. New neighbors, young couple, 2 kids, Labrador. They waved. Mason returned it a polite nod. Karen watched from her window. She didn't move. She didn't greet them. No welcome packet, no clipboard, just silence. Later that week, the couple approached Mason as he gardened. "Hey," the husband said, adjusting his sunglasses. "We've heard a few stories." Mason looked up. The man continued smiling awkwardly. "Just wanted to say, If we accidentally break some weird rule around here, we hope you'll let us know before the feds do. Mason chuckled just once. Don't worry, he said. The only rule that matters now is don't be an ass. The man laughed, relieved. The woman nodded. That's fair. And they walked off lighter than when they came. In the weeks that followed, Mason kept to his rhythm. Coffee at dawn, walks at dusk, gardening on Sundays. He rarely spoke, but when he did, people listened. Not because his words were many, but because his presence said what words couldn't. That peace was precious, that boundaries mattered, that silence wasn't weakness, it was discipline, and if necessary, it could roar. 6 months passed. The neighborhood settled into something it hadn't known for a long time. Balance. It wasn't perfect. There were still arguments about fence lines, kids left bikes on sidewalks, someone's Christmas lights stayed up through March. But there was no fear, no tension in every email thread, no patrols disguised as friendly check-ins, no public shaming dressed as community upkeep. The HOA meetings ended in under an hour now. They didn't need to be longer. There were fewer rules and fewer eyes watching. People smiled more, and more importantly, they stayed in their own lanes. Karen's house was quieter than ever, curtains drawn, porch dusty, the clipboard long gone. She had tried once to post a suggestion on the community board, a polite one, non-confrontational, no one responded. The thread died in a vacuum, and that was the end of her voice. Not by force, but by silence. The very tool she once ignored had now become her sentence. No one chased her out. They just stopped following, stopped listening. And in a world built on control, that's the cruelest end of all. Mason knew. He didn't revel in it, didn't mock her, didn't so much as mention her name again. He simply lived, cut the grass, watered the garden, waved at the mailman. Sometimes late at night he would sit on his porch and just listen to the wind, to the rustling leaves, to the low thrum of a neighborhood at peace with itself. That sound, it was everything. One night, Mason received a package, unmarked, no return address. Inside was a single item, the original HOA rulebook, yellowed at the edges, annotated in Karen's furious handwriting. On the last page, a sticky note. It was never about the car. It was about losing the only thing I knew how to hold on to. No signature, no apology, just truth. Sad, heavy, irreversible. Mason stared at it for a long moment. Then he placed it gently in his fireplace. He didn't burn it out of anger. He burned it to end the chapter, and as the pages curled into ash, he whispered, "You could have just let people live." The car still parked in the driveway, still untouched, still watching, but it had served its purpose. It wasn't bait anymore. It was a reminder that not every war starts with violence. Some begin with a clipboard and a smile, and some are ended by someone who knows when to wait. The final word didn't come from Mason. It didn't come from Karen. It came from a sign posted quietly at the entrance to the neighborhood a few months later. Welcome to Evergreen Oaks. A peaceful place because we learned the hard way. No attribution. But everyone knew who earned it and who cost it. Years later, a new family would move into Karen's old house. They never knew who lived there before. They planted fresh flowers, painted the fence, laughed late into the night with music too loud and barbecues too smoky. No one complained. Mason waved from his porch. They waved back, and the story faded, as all good ones should. No headlines, no legacy, just silence. And this time, it was earned. In the end, it wasn't the car. It wasn't the rules. It was ego masked as order. Karen believed she was protecting the neighborhood, but what she was really protecting was control. And when control is threatened, some people escalate. But the truth, real power doesn't yell. It waits. It watches. Then it ends you with silence. This was just one file. One Karen. One neighborhood that learned the hard way. Never mistake quiet for weakness. And never start a war over something you don't understand. If you thought this story was wild, there are more just like it. Subscribe to HOA Karen Files for real-life tales of suburban control gone too far. We name the rules, we name the power plays, and we name the Karens.